Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for tuning in to this month's Compassionate Women's Health Community Practitioner interview series. This month is March Endometriosis Awareness Month. Said that so smoothly. And I really wanted to focus on people and practitioners that help this condition. And so I've invited Marnie Poiner from Peach Health Physio. I'm sorry, you're going to have to say that correctly. Marnie is a physiotherapist with a special interest in pelvic health. She is currently in her last semester of her master's in sexology. She has a passion in persistent pelvic pain and sexual dysfunctions, practicing through the lens of trauma-informed care. So important for so many women in this community. Welcome, Marnie.
Hello.
Thank you so much for joining us. I'm so excited to chat to you today. So let's start. Can you tell us a little bit more about your particular modality and the main elements and how it works?
Yeah, sure. So obviously I'm a physiotherapist, not a typical physiotherapist though. So I have specialized or I have a special interest in the pelvic floor, both for men and women, but I would commonly treat women more than I treat men. And I also am currently doing my master's in sexology. So I'm sort of starting to combine both the physical elements of pelvic floor dysfunction, which is anything from, I guess, bladder and bowel issues. So struggling to go to the toilet or struggling to feel urges to empty your bladder and bowel, pain with your bladder filling or emptying, same thing with your bowels. So all of that sort of kind of continence and bladder and bowel health, all the way through to persistent pelvic pain, which can commonly be caused by things like endometriosis, but also lots of conditions can contribute to a sort of pain presentation. So working on both the physical kind of aspects of that and then the way that impacts our sexuality and our sexual functioning.
Yeah. So when you were talking just then, obviously that pelvic bowl working through from the bladder to the bowel, I heard you talking about the bladder and the bowel. What about the vagina and the vulva as well? How does your work in that area come into play?
Yeah, so I guess the way I think, I'm going to give you a brief anatomy lesson. So when I think about the whole pelvis as an entire structure and that within the body of a human, the start of our pelvic floor is actually the vulva and it's our skin. So when we're looking at the way that people experience pain, often we experience pain firstly in the skin, and then we start to get muscle involvement, or the muscle involvement starts and then we get pain in the skin. And it's all about a warning or a response system in our body. So when we have something touch or engage in the skin area of the vulva, it's going to feed back up to our brain and tell us that we're being touched. And if we were fine and we had no hesitations and we weren't bothered at all by that, you would experience it as touch, the same way you would if someone touched your arm.
Yeah.
But if we're in a protective response, or we have had experiences of pain or, discomfort with, penetration or doctor exams or periods, inserting tampons, basically what happens is the skin becomes more sensitive so that it can tell your brain that, something is touching me and I need to protect myself. And if we've had that happening for a really long time, especially, say someone who gets their period at age 11 and then I see them when they're 30, they've been experiencing potentially monthly traumatic periods, and their skin becomes so sensitive as a protective mechanism to kind of stop us from doing things like penetration, which is inherently dangerous when we're in that protect mode. So looking at the vulvar tissues, and that's more from a sensory kind of perspective. We also have things like recurrent UTIs and thrush and those sorts of things that kind of create a real inflammatory response in the skin. So that can also then contribute to that kind of pain kind of presentation. So starting at the skin is probably where I always start, and making sure that, they're our gatekeeper and our response system. So if they're kind of going off too much, then it's really difficult to talk to the muscles. So we kind of start at the skin and then I look at the muscles. Yeah.
That's so interesting, isn't it? That like when you talk about this masters in what like that movement into the sexology, and what even got you interested in the first place, that a physiotherapist is making that link from the skin. Was it through physiotherapy, or was it through the masters that you've got that greater understanding of that link between the skin and the muscles and that interplay?
Yeah, that is a great question. I definitely think my master's has probably got me thinking differently. So as a physiotherapist with that kind of background, I definitely have that real like almost like musculoskeletal way of thinking. And then moving into pelvic health, you then start thinking about what organs are doing and how our nervous system is working. And then when I got into sexology, I'm starting to think about more of the interplay between like the nervous system, but from like the brain, not just from our tissues. So when I think about skin, it often is that kind of sensory interplay between like your brain and your spinal cord and your sensory receptors in the skin. So it probably was my masters that made me sort of start to think a bit differently about how we treat persistent pelvic pain, because it's not just about muscles or organs or skin, like it's the interplay between all of it. Yeah. And then the overarching, like how does our brain and nervous system actually function in that as well. And it's that kind of combination that either, you know, hyper arouses someone's nervous system and gives this great pain experience, or something that we can like tap into and actually help to kind of calm their kind of pain experience down.
Yeah. That chicken and egg kind of situation would come into it.
Yeah. And it's difficult because I feel like every person's experience up until this point interplays with their nervous system, and there's even small experiences or things that you might consider minor, they all stack up, and then we kind of get to this point where sometimes our nervous system just feels like it's like out of control. And I find especially for females, we really hold that in our pelvic floor and our jaw. So we have this real like connection between like, you know, the top and the bottom of this system. And so, yeah, I feel like that's often where we're holding our tension.
Can you talk a little bit more about that connection from the jaw and the pelvis and how you work with that?
I find I do a lot of screening, I suppose, around the jaw. So I often ask people, especially if they've come to me with pelvic floor pain, I usually ask them about their jaw and their sleep, because they're usually both kind of impacted. The jaw is also the temporomandibular muscles and your pelvic floor muscles have an indirect influence with our limbic system. So the limbic system in our brain is what helps us basically work through big fear emotional responses, and it's our fear processing center in the brain. And if we have if that part of our brain is constantly activated, it's sending indirect signals to things like the jaw and the pelvic floor and telling them to contract. And it's in that same kind of neurological framework of like protect mode. So we're sort of always in this like guarded kind of response. So when we experience stressful situations, or maybe not necessarily an event that we think is like, oh, that's it, that's the stressful thing, but just really low grade persistent stress that we're not kind of completing stress cycles properly for, that's where it sort of adds up. And then our limbic system is just basically telling our, you know, jaw, pelvic floor, our upper traps to just be contracted. And if they're contracted for long enough, they're going to feel sore.
So that's that fight or flight shuts down the digestive, the reproductive, the immune system, doesn't it? And they're the gateways for those systems. So that makes so much sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think like the interplay between pelvic floor and like digestive health is also incredibly interesting, because there's such a big link and nothing in our body is ever independently functioning. So I treat a lot of constipation, and I love that I work really closely with a few dietitians. And so it's great because obviously there might be stuff happening in the stomach and the, like, you know, digestive tract, but then ultimately if there's also something happening at the like rectum or in the pelvic floor muscles, like no matter how great your diet is, if you don't have the technique of evacuating, you're still going to feel constipated.
Yeah.
So it's nice to have that like multidisciplinary like kind of care, so that we're actually kind of like really targeting the areas that need to be targeted, or at least clearing things. So the amount of times I do an assessment on someone purely just to see if their pelvic floor could be contributing. And if it is, we can treat it. And if it's not, then at least we know, cool, it's not pelvic floor stuff. Keep working on food or eating behaviors or that sort of stuff. So
mental health.
Yeah, that's right.
The ability to deal with the stress, as you were talking about, the stress cycle, closing up those stress cycles.
Yeah.
So critical.
Yeah, absolutely. And I feel like this is probably the overarching like reason that we have tension is like stress. But I feel like on an intellectual level, people understand that. But on like that kind of emotional and physical level, the word stress, I don't think means the same thing that it means to lots of people. So when I think of stress, I kind of think of like busyness or having kind of put too many things on my plate and I don't feel like I'm coping. And so that is a really specific feeling that I connect with. So when someone says you're stressed and you're like, I don't know, I'm not that busy, you kind of don't think, oh, but I could be stressed, but not in like an intellectual way, but in that like somatic kind of body way. And it's that stress that we talk about, but I think the language around it has maybe changed a little bit. And so when you say stress to someone, they almost just gotta go, oh yeah, all right, like I'm stressed. But if you talk to them about more of this like physical distress that your body gets caught in and it can't seem to like, get out of this protect mode, that's when we start to have this like constant kind of like downhill towards like stress mode. Yeah.
And what I find really interesting when I talk to my clients about it and they come to me feeling stressed, quite often they can identify it in their chest or their gut.
Yeah.
But it's almost like they are the common accepted areas to feel it and where they allow themselves to go. But it'd be interesting to unpack how many people really do feel it down in the reproductive organs, or whether they're just that body awareness just isn't quite there in that space.
Yeah.
Open themselves up to that and allow that, because it's hard to go there. But they definitely feel it in the body, and it's definitely there in that tension.
And I definitely, like, similar to the way that you describe or you like talk to your patients, I always ask them, where do you feel that, rather than like, I just think that we're all such smart women that like, we can intellectualize everything and everything can be like rationalized. But if you say to someone like, when I ask if I can do a vaginal exam on you, how does that sit with you? Like, where do you feel that? And some of my, I guess, trauma patients or, patients who've been in and out of the medical system over and over again, they've been poked and prodded and all that sort of stuff. And I say, how does it make you feel if I was to do an exam? And they get this kind of icky feeling that they just go, oh, no, I don't want that.
Yeah.
And it's that nervous system response that drives our pelvic floor activity. And so me doing an exam on that person in that moment is obviously completely counterproductive to what we're trying to achieve. Yeah. And so pulling away from like the physical aspect and going, we'll get there, like the tissues are important, but we actually need to work on that feeling first and make you feel safe, so that when we go to the tissues, your guarding response isn't like massive and going to stop us.
Yeah, that's right. It's a completely different benchmark that you're working with then, isn't it?
Yeah. But I think it does help to talk and change the language of the way that we're like discussing these things with people, because I feel like it makes more sense if we can connect with it on that real like somatic level. So have that like body connection with it, rather than just having the understanding. I mean, the understanding is really important, and sometimes we need that to make the leap, but sometimes we know too much and then we really need to just switch the brain off and just feel what's happening. And there is lots of people who come in and they go, I feel it in my pelvic floor. My pelvis is tight. Like I feel that. And so I have one kind of demographic of patients that feel it. They really feel it. And it's so frustrating because they can't stop feeling it. And then I have the other demographic of patients where they're so body dissociated from their pelvis that they don't feel it. And what happens is they miss those little tiny cues that tell them that they're building stress and tension in the body. And it's not until they're like, boom, like you're hit with it.
Screaming at them.
Yeah. So they've got to get to like a flare up before they're like, oh, I'm really tight right now.
Yeah.
But if we can catch that, you know, probably 5 days ago when it actually started building, we probably could have prevented such a big pain experience. Yeah. So learning how to reconnect with your pelvis in both like a, you know, a mental kind of like, can we take you there? And sometimes that's really challenging.
Yeah.
And also physically, like, you know, can we touch the area? Can we engage with it? And so, yeah, half the battle with people is that dissociation with the pelvis is so strong because it's been an area of pain for such a long time, or, you know, it's not served them in the way that, you know, it should have. And so, yeah, that dissociation is the first thing that we've got to kind of reconnect with.
Yeah. Yeah. And I can appreciate that there, as you were saying, with that ability to intellectualize it, they'll be saying, yes, you can examine it because I know that's what should happen.
Yeah.
And then, but then when you take that step to do it, are you actually getting a measure of the true muscle strength, etc.? Or subconscious going, actually, no, we're not okay. But the conscious mind is only 5% of the mind, and that 95% below the surface, if they're not consciously aware of it, could be giving a different answer.
Yeah. And I mean, I think I'm in the lucky, I guess, group of practitioners that can touch our patients. And so it's great because if I think that I'm getting really good consent from someone, we've verbalized it, we've discussed how the exam goes, and then I get them up onto the table and we go to start the exam, I also have the ability to see whether or not they're also like body consenting to me, not just like intellectually. And if I start seeing that they're not actually body consenting to me, even if they're like, no, I really want you to examine me, it's not worth it. And I already know what I'm going to find. Like, the examination isn't for me to find something, it's for me to start to teach you how to relax the muscles or breathe better, or, you know, it's that feedback that I can provide by touching you. But touching you in the first place isn't necessary for me to know what's going on.
Yeah. You get that sense of that congruence with the true answer. Yeah.
And you can see it, like, you know, and then you can talk to them about it and be like, well, can you feel that your legs are closing right now? Or can you feel that your breath has gotten really shallow, or you're sweating a little bit? Like, are you feeling okay? And sometimes people don't even realize, like, they have limited connection with their body functions, and they don't realize that their body's not consenting, even though they've said, yeah, absolutely, keep doing it. And it's such a powerful thing to see, and then to be able to kind of slow down and actually get them to start to connect with parts of their body. And I always try and start with like the safe or neutral parts of our body. So it might be your hands or your ears, or areas of your body that you've never thought negatively about, and then really start to bring in some like awareness, sensory awareness. You know, maybe you go home and you practice walking on grass and sand and tiles, and just kind of really feeling what it feels like to be grounded. And then once you're starting to really connect with your body, we can kind of go to those more tricky areas and learn how to connect to them as well.
Yeah. So how do you feel that your clients go with that slowing down? Because I can appreciate there'd be someone who are like, oh, come on, just fix me, please. And then there's, because I, you know, 13 plus years ago, I've been like, really? You want me to slow down and actually like unpack this? I don't know. So how do you go with that education around it might feel really slow right now, but you're going to like get there kind of thing?
Yeah. I guess I often, I try and have really good educations to start with about how we work on, like, how our body physically works and how it responds to the like neurological like components of our body. And often I try and use I kind of try and explain that if we do something slowly at first and we ask for permission from our own bodies, if we can do something and we wait for that permission to be granted, we then move much quicker.
Mm.
And if we don't ask for permission and then we just do it anyway, then your body stops trusting you.
Yeah.
So I kind of always talk about how I need to remain a safe person to them, because if I'm not a safe person to them, then they're going to have to find a new therapist, because, you know, it's really hard. Again, yeah. So I would prefer to take things slow and always be that safe person for them, especially because they might not be a safe person to themselves, or their partner might not be safe. So if I can maintain my safety kind of with them, then at least we'll find an in. And then if we can kind of start in that slow way and they see some really slow kind of important progressions happening, I think they trust the process a little bit more. And I do fully understand the like frustrations, but most of the time those people kind of go away and do too much and then come back and be like, it didn't work, like what's going on? And then I just re-explain again, we actually really have to respect our nervous system, and if you go too hard, it will tell you that it doesn't want to do that. And I often talk about that icky feeling. So I sort of split up our nervous system kind of responses, or the way that our body talks to us. And I talk about how we have the icky feeling and then we have pain. Neither of them indicate that we are damaged or that something is wrong, but it tells us that something might go wrong. And so when we get this icky feeling, which some people kind of feel like, it's like that gut feeling that you know something's wrong. Like you feel it, you know that you can't put your finger on it, but you're like, something doesn't feel right.
Yeah.
So that's kind of like our pre-pain warning signal. And it's much more subtle and it's much easier for us to ignore, whereas pain is a lot harder for us to ignore. Yeah. But if we really do like slow down and listen to that icky feeling, you'll find the place where you are truly uncomfortable but safe. And if we can work at that limit where you feel safe, but we are a little bit uncomfortable, and we work there for as long as we need to, you will notice the icky feeling lift. And then we'll be able to work closer. And when the icky feeling moves, our pain line also moves. Yeah. And we just keep shifting those lines together rather than just going and barreling through and just hitting pain and being like, cool, we found it. Yeah. You know, nervous system doesn't love that. So if we kind of take a more slow approach and work on that kind of connection first, it does, you eventually start going really quickly and you'll move really fast, because your body will actually know, I trust you. And if we can kind of build that at the start, it does get quicker. Whereas if it takes us a long time to build that trust because we keep kind of blowing it out and hitting pain, it just kind of slows us down in the long run. So I often kind of give that explanation. Like if we go too hard, it slows us down. But if we go slow, it speeds us up. So kind of hard to think about and frustrating, totally frustrating, especially if I'm not the first person that you've seen. So yeah, but hopefully I educated in a way that people at least give me a shot to show them that difference.
That pre-frame conversation right at the beginning is so fundamental, isn't it, to set up how we're going to work. And I love what you're talking about as being such a beautiful practice of boundaries.
Yeah.
And such an important place to practice those boundaries as well.
Yeah. And I think that people just don't realize, because we're always living in our intellectual brain and we never really slow down and just kind of feel things. And it's much harder to feel things than it is to just like think about things.
Yeah.
And so it's quite challenging, especially when we get into more of the like, you know, intimacy and sexual dysfunction stuff, because if there's a partner involved, then that's just another layer of challenges that we have to kind of talk through. And I love it when people bring their partners in. So I'll often do lots of sessions where I have, you know, the couple together, so we can kind of workshop things. I can teach them how to safely touch their partners and, you know, work through a whole bunch of things that are, you know, unconsciously unsafe and they just don't realize. And so I find that can be like quite a helpful strategy.
Amazing. How did you personally sort of funnel into this specific field?
I always wanted to be a physio. which was like, even in like year 10, I remember wanting to do it. And then I got steered in the direction of law. And I did that when I graduated instead, only for 6 months before I realized I hated it. So didn't do that. And then I kind of like fluffed around for a little bit. And then I decided, you know what, you've wanted to do physio forever, so just go and do it. So I did physio. And then as I was kind of going through, we did this really great subject on like pelvic health, basically. And so I feel like that was like, I kind of already knew I was interested, but I really feel like that helped solidify that I was interested. So pretty much when I graduated, like the first course I did pretty much was women's health. And it was this moment of like, almost like a shock at how naive I was about my own body. And I felt like, you know, I have struggled with being sick pretty much my whole life. And it was like at the end of this 5-day course, I just realized what was happening in my body. And I thought, you know, some of the things I was able to kind of be like, wow, this is why I have pain when I have sex. And I was able to kind of start to like investigate things that I've never even thought about asking someone. Like, you know, never the thought in my head that was like, sex shouldn't be painful. And it was just, you know, and this was like maybe 8 years ago that I had this realization. And I was, just, I guess it kind of just like clicked a whole few things in my head. And it was such a powerful experience for me that I then kind of went, you know what, I feel like everybody should know this. Like everybody should know everything about their bodies. And I don't know why we don't teach people this stuff. And so now I feel like I've just gone on my like as my career has kind of built and I've gotten really into like women's health and empowering women, I've kind of realized that it actually starts with kids. And so I'm really, that was part of why I wanted to do my master's in sexology, was to become a sexual educator for like, you know, teenagers. And you know, so it's still something that I'm like slowly working on in the background, but I'd love to, you know, teach young kids, girls and boys, about the menstrual cycle and about puberty and what happens in our body and how babies are made, and age appropriate kind of education around these things that would have made a huge difference in my life at many points if I'd known these things. And it would also stop, you know, my 60 and 70-year-old patients that come to me and have had pelvic pain their entire lives. And we do just a small amount of, you know, activities and stuff, and it goes away. And you just kind of think like, if it wasn't such a shameful or taboo topic to discuss these things, we don't need to have as many problems as we have. And so I feel like, my journey started because, you know, I was sick, and it kind of, I decided I wanted to fix myself. I feel like that's why most practitioners get into things.
Totally.
And then I feel like, throughout the last few years, I kind of went from being really physical therapy based, and then kind of having my own, I guess, like mental health stuff, where I realized that there's no way to separate the body and the mind. And so being a physical therapist that doesn't think about the way the mind works just didn't work for me anymore.
Missing
so it was.
But even what you're talking about, you know, setting up that fundamental education at such a young age will actually reduce the mental health impacts as they get older.
Even the discussions around like female sexuality and pleasure, because that's a hot taboo subject and nobody really wants to talk about it, because we're afraid if we discuss it with young girls that it will make them promiscuous. But that isn't reflected in any of the research that we have, because all the research we have shows that if we teach people about sex earlier, they make better informed decisions. So, and also the amount of girls that I see who are late teens or, you know, early 20s, and they just are filled with so much shame about their bodies or their genitals, or the idea of pleasure not being for them but for their partner. And then they have all this pain with penetration, but it's because they don't enjoy it. It's because we were never taught that it's okay for us to experience pleasure, and it's a part of our function. Like we're the only people that have a pleasure organ exclusively for women, exclusively for pleasure. So as if pleasure was not designed for us.
Yeah.
But society doesn't teach us that. And if anything, we have too many kind of those like undercurrent, like negative things about sexuality. Even when you see, you know, beautiful women on advertising and stuff, and they're beautiful for men. And that's a problem. Like, that's a problem with our pleasure and our sexuality, because that's not really what it's about. But there's lots and lots of really important research and wonderful practitioners all over the world that are really like trying to get to the bottom of this and try and change the way that society behaves around like sexuality and pleasure. So I feel like we've got a lot to come, like we've got a lot to go, but I also feel like there's a lot of people on board trying to make it happen.
Yeah, amazing. That's so good. So what are some of the success stories that you'd love to share with, you know, a couple of your clients who have come through your doors?
Yeah, I mean, I think some of my favorite success stories are always the patients that I see who have never ever been able to have sex. It's always painful, and they've built up this really big kind of fear response cycle to having penetration, and they want to have a baby, and babies are made through sex most of the time. So that's a really typical presentation that I get. And then the most exciting thing is when I get a text from them, or they come into their appointment and tell me that they're pregnant. And it's just that moment where you realize that like you helped them get to the point that they can have sex, and then they fell pregnant.
Amazing.
Yeah. So I really love like those kind of cases.
Yeah.
And I feel like it happens more often than, like when I think back on it, it happens more often than I realize, where that's like, that was the goal, and then they get pregnant, and it's so exciting.
Yeah.
And then I would also say people coming back to me and just saying, I can manage this now. Like, some of these conditions are conditions that obviously we live with forever, and they don't necessarily go away, but they also don't have to rule our lives.
Yeah.
And so, you know, someone who can come back to me and say, I almost had a flare up the other day, but I did X, Y, and Z that you had suggested, and I put my TENS machine on, and I actually just gave myself a day of grace, and then I actually didn't have a flare up. You know, my pain was tolerable, and I was able to go to work. And you know, in those moments, it's like they don't have to be that like bam exciting kind of thing, but it's just that you've given someone the power to like feel like they can keep going and take care of themselves. So and I would say that's a real common kind of demographic of patients that I see as well.
Yeah, and that is a big win. You know, when we're talking about these chronic complex conditions, where cure and fixing isn't always or rarely feasible.
Yeah.
We need those small wins. We need those moments where I avoided a flare up is the celebration.
Yeah. Or I felt the icky feeling and I paused, and I was able to kind of be like, why is my protect response going off right now? And then being able to kind of like work through that. And I feel like that's really like learning how to feel your body and reconnect with it is so challenging, especially for patients who've had trauma or, you know, births that didn't go the way they want them to go, or they've been in and out of hospitals and prodded and poked by medical professionals. You know, I feel like to have that moment of reconnect and it not being super scary, like that's a big moment.
Definitely.
Yeah.
So have you got some key tips that you think are fundamental for good women's health that you'd love to share with the group?
Yeah. I mean, if you've ever been a patient of mine, you will know that the first thing that I teach is breathing, and it is so underutilized. And I would say it is the most powerful thing that we can do from so many levels. Breathing and getting really good diaphragmatic movement literally stretches your pelvic floor. So when the diaphragm and the pelvic floor, like when the diaphragm basically contracts and gives us that big breath, it pushes your pelvic floor down and we get this lovely stretch. And then when we breathe out, we get this lovely recoil. And if we don't breathe diaphragmatically, or we rarely do, which often happens when we're stuck in that distress mode, your pelvic floor gets really stiff and your diaphragm gets really stiff. So from a complete structural perspective, learning to breathe will make your pelvic floor move better. And then we also know that, you know, our breath and the center of our body is where our autonomic nervous system lives. So learning to breathe better literally moves that area better and helps our nervous system move better. And then it works on all of those different kind of sympathetic and parasympathetic sort of levels of relaxation. So I feel like it's such a powerful tool because it can be structural and it can also be neurological and totally underutilized. And also so many people have no idea how to breathe well. It's like, you know, we do it literally every second of the day. And I guarantee like maybe 1% of my caseload like breathes, and I'm like, wow, that is a good breath. Most of the time I can kind of be like, you know, yeah, we're not moving here, or you're pushing here, or, you know, that breath doesn't look easy. And then if we can kind of practice that like a skill, like learning how to play tennis, it gets easier. And then all of a sudden your body has many more options than the one breathing style that you had. So I think that's like the key, breathing.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you so much.
That is okay. Thanks for having me.
Oh, I've loved this conversation, Marnie. I love that holistic approach that you have to the body and women's health. So thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and your insights and your experience. I really, really appreciate it. So ladies, if you've got any questions, Marnie is going to put how you can get in touch with her in the comments. And she's happy for you to ask questions. Obviously, she can't answer individual, that's a personal in-session kind of conversation, but general queries, please pop them below and she's happy to answer however she can. So thank you again, Marnie.